You pulled on a jacket this morning without thinking. Not survival, just habit. A 2-second gesture so automatic it barely registers as a choice. You assumed the cold was an inconvenience you were managing, but that jacket represents the end of something. A 300,000-year chain of decisions made by people who had no margin for error, who invented the concept of layered insulation from scratch. In the dark, in temperatures that would kill you in hours, and did it so well that the basic principle hasn't changed since. Here is what nobody told you about the Ice Age. It wasn't a catastrophe our ancestors survived. It was the crucible that built them. So what does that mean for you? Sitting here, warm, descended from the only primate that ever looked at a glacier and decided to stay? The answer will change what you think you're made of. 20,000 years ago, your ancestors lived through the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered a third of the planet's land. Average temperatures across Europe sat roughly 10 degrees colder than today. The growing season essentially didn't exist at northern latitudes. Subtract agriculture, subtract metal, subtract every form of stored energy except fire and body fat. What remained? Stone, bone, hide, and each other. That is not a poetic reduction. That is the complete inventory. Every cognitive leap that defines modern humanity, language, art, complex planning, social trust across large groups, was forged inside those conditions. Not despite them, because of them. How long can a primate survive without tools in minus 30-degree wind? About 4 hours. Your ancestors lasted 30,000 winters. In 2016, archaeologists excavating the Kostenki-Borshchevo sites along Russia's Don River, sites occupied by Homo sapiens between 30,000 and 40,000 years ago, found something that collapsed several assumptions simultaneously. Bone needles? Not crude points, needles with eyes. Refined enough to sew fitted, multi-layered garments from animal hides, the kind of tailored construction that traps dead air between layers and creates insulation comparable to modern cold weather gear. Here is the mechanism. A loosely draped hide loses heat through convection. A fitted, multi-layer garment with sealed seams traps a thin layer of warm air against the skin and maintains core temperature in conditions that would otherwise be fatal. That is not primitive technology. That is applied thermodynamics. One needle with an eye represents the difference between a body that loses heat and a body that keeps it. And Kostenki's needles predate the medieval period by 25,000 years. This is not an exaggeration. Anthropologist Olga Soffer spent decades analyzing Upper Paleolithic sites across Eastern Europe, publishing research that fundamentally reframed how we understand Ice Age social structure. What she found at the Mezherich site in Ukraine, occupied roughly 15,000 years ago, were the remains of 5 structures built entirely from mammoth bone, not sheltered in existing caves. Deliberately engineered, curved tusks used as structural arches, hundreds of individual bones interlocked in geometric patterns. The largest structure required the bones of approximately 95 individual mammoths. Think about what that demands organizationally. Tracking mammoth movements across seasons, coordinating retrieval across a landscape, allocating labor across multiple skill sets, maintaining shared purpose across a group through months of construction. Soffer argued this wasn't just shelter building. It was the emergence of what she called social storage, the capacity to maintain coordinated effort toward future goals across time and people. That cognitive architecture, built under existential cold pressure, is the same one that eventually produced every institution humans have ever created. Civilization didn't begin with agriculture, it began at Mezherich, in the dark, around a shared fire inside a house made of giants. In 2019, neuroscientist Marcos Frank at Washington State University, building on earlier chronobiology research, studied what happens to human sleep physiology when artificial light is removed entirely and subjects live by firelight alone. Participants spent weeks in conditions approximating pre-industrial darkness. No electricity, no screens, fire as the only light source after sunset. Their melatonin onset shifted dramatically earlier. Their core body temperature followed the ancient 2-phase drop. Most strikingly, without instruction, without suggestion. Participants began waking spontaneously in the middle of the night, alert, calm, and cognitively open, before returning to sleep naturally. Nobody told them to do this. The body simply remembered. Frank described it as a system returning to factory settings, as if the modern sleep schedule were a patch running on top of original code. And removing the inputs that enforced it allowed the underlying program to reassert itself. 30,000 years of Ice Age nights are still in your biology, running silently, waiting. You just haven't given them the conditions to surface. Over 500 documented references across 10,000 years of human record, medieval French legal texts describing le premier somme and le deuxième somme, Renaissance medical manuals prescribing activities specifically for the watch, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Charles Dickens' Homer's Odyssey, even a letter from the American frontier describing 2 sleeps as unremarkable fact. Historians read these references for centuries and kept translating around them because they could not imagine that people had ever slept differently than they did. The assumption contaminated the scholarship. The pattern was hiding in the primary sources the entire time. 1879. Edison's commercial electric bulb. Darkness becomes optional for the wealthy. 1920s, factory shift work standardizes the consolidated 8-hour block as an economic requirement, not a biological one. 1950s. Television colonizes the hours between first and second sleep, filling the watch with programming designed to prevent the mind from going quiet. By 1990, the two-phase sleep pattern has essentially vanished from clinical literature, reclassified not as a lost norm but as a symptom, insomnia. A disorder, something to be treated rather than a frequency to be recovered. The word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, literally, cover the fire. Even the language remembered what we forgot. You wake at 3 a.m., mind running, unable to return to sleep. You call it anxiety. You call it insomnia, you treat it as malfunction. But what if it isn't? What if it's a 30,000-year-old system asserting itself through the only gap in your schedule it can find? The 1 hour when the stimulation stops. And the original code gets enough silence to run? What if you're not broken? What if you've just been running someone else's operating system for so long? You forgot the original was still there? Somewhere in southern France. 32,000 years ago, someone carried fire deep into the Chauvet cave. They went past the entrance, past the light, into the absolute dark of a limestone chamber where no predator would follow, and no practical task required their presence, and there, by the shifting light of a single flame, they painted horses in motion, using the natural contours of the rock to give the animals dimension, using charcoal gradients to suggest speed, spending hours creating something that no survival calculation could justify. We traded that, the unhurried interior hour, the firelit space where the mind moved freely between what was real and what was possible, for the convenience of a light that never goes out. The jacket you pulled on this morning is the end of that chain. The last gesture in a sequence that began with someone pressing bone through hide in the dark, by firelight, in minus 30 degrees, figuring out how to stay warm in a world that offered no guarantees. They solved the cold, they built the house, they painted the horse. And somewhere in the act of making life easier, we lost the part of the night where we knew who we were. Most of us don't even know it's gone.